Welcome to this session exploring the question, what are the limits of AI? My name is Sandy Starr and I'm Deputy Director of the Progress Educational Trust, which is a charity that works in the fields of fertility, genomics, and embryo and stem cell research. And I'm also the author of a recent pamphlet about AI. Now, we had a session in this room earlier this afternoon where we looked at the apocalyptic side of AI, and we asked whether and how certain limits should be placed on AI via regulation. And we want to keep that question in mind at this session while shifting our focus to ask whether there are intrinsic limits to AI, things it cannot do reliably and may never be able to do reliably. And for context, the UK government will be holding its high-profile AI Safety Summit in just a few days' time, and has chosen as its location for that summit the iconic setting of Bletchley Park, in an obvious attempt to evoke the legacy of the computing pioneer Alan Turing. And what we want to do in this discussion is take that legacy seriously, perhaps even more seriously than the government is taking it. We're going to look at, among other things, the origins of electronic computing in general and AI in particular, and we're going to explore what that history means for the questions we face today. We have a superb panel of speakers to help us do this, and because this is intended to be quite an open-ended, exploratory session, they haven't been asked to prepare introductions. Instead, I'm going to have a conversation with each of them in turn to find out what they think. And then after that, I'm going to open up the conversation and invite you to put questions and comments to them as well. And I'll introduce them briefly now in the order in which I'm going to speak to them, but I encourage you to look at their full biographies on the Battle of Ideas website to find out about their many accomplishments. So the sequence goes down the table from furthest to me until closest to me. So first I'm going to speak to Professor Anders C. Hansen, who's a mathematician. Anders leads the Applied Functional and Harmonic Analysis Group at the University of Cambridge. He's co-author of the book Compressive Imaging, and he's been thinking deeply for many years about the nature and the limits of computing and AI. So he's ideally placed to get this discussion started. Then we have Timandra Harkness, who is a prolific and wide-ranging writer and broadcaster. Much of Timandra's work, though by no means all of it, focuses on science and technology. She's author of the book Big Data, Does Size Matter?, which I think has helped a lot of us to make sense of this whole area during the past few years. And I'm curious to hear what she makes of the latest developments. Then we have Dr. Stuart Derbyshire, who's an associate professor of psychology at the National University of Singapore. He has a long-standing interest in aspects of the human mind and brain, including the meaning and experience of pain, how imaging technology can be used to study brain activity, and the nature of consciousness itself. So he can help us understand whether and in what sense machines can emulate humans. Then we have Dr. Kathleen Stock, who's a philosopher among many other things. Kathleen is co-founder and co-director of the Lesbian Project. She's author of the book Material Girls, Why Reality Matters for Feminism, and she's a columnist for the publication Unheard. And a couple of Kathleen's recent articles for Unheard cast a particularly interesting light on AI, and I look forward to asking you, Kathleen, to expand upon those observations in those articles. And then last but not least, we have Andrew Orlovsky, who's a technology and business journalist of many years standing. I think he'd prefer business and technology journalist. Hack. He's a columnist for the Daily Telegraph. He writes for a number of other publications, including Spiked. And I think it's fair to say he's been an acerbic voice in recent discussions about AI. So let's begin with you, Anders. And the first thing I want to ask you about is the word foundation. because this word pops up a lot. The models that underpin modern generative AI are called foundation models, or sometimes they're called that. The government task force looking at this whole area, it's now called the Frontier AI Taskforce, but it was initially called the Foundation Models Task Force. And the word foundation pops up a lot, I notice, in your work, Anders, and in descriptions of what you do. So could you just explain what the word foundation means to you in your line of work?
Right. Well, I think there's many definitions of what foundations would be, but I think most of these definitions will probably include having knowledge or a theory for boundaries and the limits of what you can do, which is really what I'm focusing in my research. And you may say, well, it's a rather pessimistic view of life to dedicate your career to do what can you not do? Why shouldn't we investigate what you can do instead? I want to show this with an example. Some of you may know what happened at NeurIPS 2017. And if you haven't heard about this story, you should Google it. Ali Rahimi, who's a very well-respected researcher at Google, won the Test of Time Award. And he spent his Test of Time Award acceptance speech to essentially liken modern machine learning and AI to alchemy. And that didn't go down well with everybody. Jan LeCun took great issues with this. There's a feisty debate documented on the web. You should Google this. And the whole issue here is really about the foundations. And you can agree with Rahimi or you can disagree with Rahimi. But what we all can is that we can learn from the alchemists. And the important thing is that what did the alchemists want to do? Well, they wanted to create gold. And how would they do that? Well, they will take a little pot, add a little bit of green, a little bit of yellow, stir. No gold. We can fix this. A little bit of red. Stir again. No gold. You can iterate that procedure infinitely. The issue is that you will never figure out that you cannot create gold. And the important part is that that type of research methodology will never be able to understand the limitations. You will just continue and continue. And you need to have a completely different way and a different research methodology to understand that you cannot create gold. Now, it would have been very different from the alchemist if somebody had told them that you cannot do it. And that's really the part of the foundations for which you need to have a different type of research methodology to understand what you may not be able to do. And if you understand that, we can guide us to also understand what we can do. So this is one of the sort of key, teachings that we have from history of science is that we need to have different types of research methodologies to understand the foundation in terms of limits.
And you've drawn some interesting parallels in your work between what we're exploring now with AI and certain things that were happening 100 years ago in mathematics, in logic. Can you explain a little bit more about what was happening back then and why it's relevant now?
Right. So we're now in a situation which is very reminiscent of what happened in mathematics in the beginning of the 20th century. Now we know about AI, but we really don't know AI. And ironically, that was also the situation in the beginning of the 20th century. It sounds crazy. The word crisis was used. And the word crisis was used because one didn't have the foundations. And this was realized by David Hilbert, who was at the time one of the most, if not the most prominent mathematician. And he initiated what became Hilbert's program on the foundations of mathematics. And we had then Turing and Gödel, who contributed to this program enormously, and essentially turned the fields completely upside down. And how did they do that? They showed fundamental limits. Gödel showed that there are mathematical statements that you cannot prove or disprove. This sounds completely crazy. Turing showed that there are basic problems in computations that a computer cannot solve. And if there are basic limitations on what a computer can do, that means that there will be basic limitations of what AI can do. So we ended up essentially, or we're ending up now in a situation which is very close to where we were in the beginning of the 20th century regarding mathematics. And one needed to establish the foundations. And these are some of the most profound and deep results in science ever. And as a result of this, Steve Smale, who's one of the most influential American mathematicians of the 20th and the 21st century, wrote a list of big mathematical problems for the 21st century. Hilbert did this for the 20th century. And the last on that list, number 18, asks, what are the limits of AI? Of course, this is not a mathematical question for which you can ask and sort of draw two lines. It is a call for a program. But it's based on the idea that we needed to understand the foundations in mathematics and computations, and we need to understand that in terms of AI, and we need to understand the limits.
Okay. And just before we come to the present, just to linger a tiny bit longer in the past, algorithm is a word that gets used a lot now. Our lives are governed by algorithms and so forth. David Hilbert, whom you've just mentioned, was very keen on algorithms 100 years ago, and in fact, the word is centuries old. Since there wasn't electronic computing then, what would the word algorithm have meant to David Hilbert?
So this is an interesting issue. So Hilbert, in his 10th problem, asked, can you find the algorithm that will determine if a Diophantine equation has integer solutions or not? This is math technology. Don't care about that. He said, find the algorithm. It was written in German. Germans have translated that to me to be sort of a method. And it was Turing who really defined what an algorithm is. That's a Turing machine. But Hilbert was convinced that there exists an algorithm that could determine if a Diophantine equation has integer solutions or not. So he didn't ask, does there exist? He said, find it. And the ironic thing is that the answer to Hilbert's 10th problem is that no such algorithm exists. So Hilbert, who was, as I mentioned, one of the greatest mathematicians, not just at that time, but also in the history of math, was wrong. That doesn't make him any less of a mathematician. He firmly believed that you can solve everything with a computer. And it took 70 years of hardcore mathematical research to show that no such algorithm exists.
Okay, so someone hasn't had this message, Rishi Sunak, because he gave his speech at the Royal Society, his big speech on AI last week. And he asked, how can we write laws that make sense for something we don't yet fully understand? I suppose it's good that he knows we don't yet fully understand it. What would your response to that question be, Anders? How do we make laws for something we don't fully understand?
Well, that is extremely delicate. And so the issues for people like me who are mathematicians is that we need to facilitate the society with a fundamental understanding of what can be done and what cannot be done. And that will have impact also in legislation. And one of the big issues now is hallucinations in AI. And I assume that many of you have played with the chatbots. The chatbots are amazing. I'm not saying that they're bad, but they do hallucinate. They will give you very eloquent stuff that can be complete nonsense. And hallucinations in AI is widespread. It has been known for many years. In many other areas, what happened with the chatbots was really that the phenomenon of hallucination was brought into the living rooms of the general public, and you see how it works. And the big issue is then, can you make AI that doesn't hallucinate? Or can you make AI that figure out when it's right or wrong? And then what one can show mathematically is that there are basic examples of problems for which there will exist a perfect AI that doesn't hallucinate, but there doesn't exist an algorithm that can compute it, meaning that any attempts of creating it will create hallucinations. This is not the paradox. The final paradox is this. You cannot check if the AI hallucinates or not. And what that means, a corollary in mathematics is something that follows from a theorem. The corollary of that is that the only way that you can have trustworthy AI would be an AI that says, I don't know. When I, as a human, I have a lot of limitations. There are certain things that I know. I know a little bit of maths, but there's tons of things that I really don't know. And the way you can sort of trust me is that, Anders, look at this, and I can say, this I know something about. I'll tell you what that is. But you can ask me, and I will say, I have absolutely no idea. In fact, I am actually exposed to non-computable problems, as Turing would have said, on a daily basis. And the way I'm trustworthy is I say, I don't know. So there is no theoretical limitation on creating AI that could say, I don't know. The problem is that we have not the faintest idea on how to do it. Current AI will say, with great confidence, complete nonsense, and we have absolutely no way of making it say, right now, I don't know what I'm doing.
So we have all these deliberations going on at the moment. We have them in Brussels, we have them in Washington, we have this thing in Bletchley Park next week, where people are trying to, they're asking, how can we hold AI to certain standards? The phrase explainable AI comes up a lot. The phrase trustworthy comes up a lot. I mean, is this possible? Can these new legal obligations or regulatory obligations we're creating, I mean, can they be met, do you think?
Well, this is a very delicate issue of law meeting maths. Yes. I can only approve things that says these are things you can do and these are things you cannot do. Now, I will leave to the lawyers to decide what should go into the writings of the law, but with the current technology, a lot of the trust and the explainability is unlikely to be met, at least with a mathematical definition. And this is why things become very interesting, because this is not just the new EU AI Act, but the GDPR, the General Data Protection Act, which has a very interesting part of it. It says that any automatic decision which is based on your data, you can require, and this is word I'm quoting, a meaningful and logical explanation. There is, to my knowledge, very, very little AI products out there that can actually do this. And that becomes interesting, because that means that in many cases, this will be illegal with the current framework. Also in the UK, my understanding is that we are bound by that because that was set before Brexit, whereas things are different in the United States. For those who might be interested, you should Google the COMPASS algorithm. The COMPASS algorithm is an algorithm which is used in the United States legal system for predicting if a felon should be a repeated felon or not. It takes the file of the felon and it spits out a number. If the number is high, the likelihood is high, according to the machine or the AI, that the felon will be a repeated criminal. And if the number is low. There's no explanation of this. There's no logic behind. The computer says yes or no, but it's legal. And it's not bound by the GDPR Act that is law in Europe. And I'm not here as a politician, I'm here as a mathematician, but it's worth asking the question, should it be legal or should it not be legal? So that goes back to your question. Will we be able to meet these requirements? Well, it would depend on the standard we set. And I predict that the COMPASS algorithm will not be legal in Europe, but I'm not a legal expert, but it might be legal elsewhere.
Okay. I might leave it there for now, Anders, but I definitely want to come back to you and pick up on some of that. I might move to you, Timandra. I feel like I'm getting old, because it seems to me like only yesterday I went to the launch of your book, Big Data, Does Size Matter? And now you look at explanations of the history of AI, and it says, well, back then we had the big data era, and now we're in this whole new era. So it's like, oh, blimey. So, yes, have things changed drastically since that book came out, Timandra, or is it more of a continuum from your point of view?
I think it is more of a continuum, but there have been some changes. I mean, one thing I think that has changed, just to be almost cynical about this, the reason I wrote it when I wrote it, which was came out 2016, was that a lot of people were talking about big data. It was a phrase that was being bandied about, and as someone who'd only just got over discovering that everyone was obsessed with statistics and yet everyone hated maths, which was really confusing for me. I then realised that now everyone was obsessed with big data but still hated maths. And so I was like, okay, well, is there really something new and amazing here, or is this just one of those cultural hype moments? Are people who don't understand maths looking to big data to do lots of things that they wish something other than them could do? And the answer was yes, but also that actually you could do a lot of interesting things with what they call big data, which was, fundamentally lots of data, much of which is collected by somebody else for something else, and then you can repurpose it and ask it new questions and combine data from different sources and ask new questions that were not asked when it was all collected. I think those are the kind of fundamental things that were new and different about it. And of course AI came into that because by definition you're working with amounts of data much too big for a human being to get their head around without artificial help. And I think one thing that's changed is that, culturally, big data, that's old hat. Now it's all about AI. But in another way, of course, it hasn't changed fundamentally, because what was happening then was suddenly there's lots of data available just as a byproduct of us doing everything digitally, and we're using broadly AI programs to get useful information from it and make use of it. And that is still fundamentally happening, more so, if anything, obviously, because the more we do digitally, the more data is generated, and the programs have got faster and more sophisticated. So in that sense, I think it is more of the same. I think there are some cultural changes. One thing I found back then was that when I wrote a lot about how all your data is collected by other people and companies and used for their purposes and not your purposes, this was still news to a lot of people, and a lot of people really like, you what? For example, I was writing about how algorithms were used in political campaigning and data-based political campaigning, targeting people, using their data for what kind of political messages they would get online. And it was slightly galling to me that the book came out slightly before the whole Cambridge Analytica thing, and then suddenly everything was like, we've discovered this thing, would you believe it? They're using data for political campaigning. And I'm like, excuse me, if you look in chapter whatever it was, yes, I was talking about this. But what I think is, so culturally I think what I think is interesting is that now a lot of people know about this and the data and the privacy thing, and yet I don't think anything has changed that significantly on that front. People complain about it more, but I don't think it's fundamentally changed.
Yeah, so I remember you trying to put it in perspective when people said, oh my goodness, that people are warping elections and campaigns. And you're like, yeah, but the other side already did it, and you didn't complain then. But now, of course, there are new developments, though. There are very convincing deepfakes. There are likely to be more, the way things are going. Earlier session today, someone talked about Slovakian elections, I think it was, big deepfake scandal. So in that sense, is there actually a more difficult challenge to grapple with, or do you think can we do something about that?
On that front, yes, and when people talk about the dangers of AI, I think one of the more convincing ones is the industrial production of... I really hesitate to use the words misinformation or disinformation, because I think they're inaccurate and also, in a sense, kind of irrelevant, because you can distribute perfectly accurate information to the right people at the right time and have a cultural effect that you want. So I do think that's an issue, but obviously there are directly faked materials that, I'm assured, I haven't tried it yet, but that you could easily fake my voice saying things that I would never say, and then distribute it and say, well, look at what she said. And that is a problem, although, the optimist in me hopes that what it will do will make us all a bit more sceptical about information in general, and a bit more keen to say, where did this come from? Why am I being told this? Who's telling me it? Can I cross-check it with other sources? So it is obviously part of a much bigger cultural problem, and in a sense the AI and the data is is just a tool that's being used in that context.
And in terms of the limit, what AI can do, the limits of AI, I was talking to Anders about explainable AI, trustworthy AI. You've posed it slightly differently recently. The sorts of concepts you use, I've noticed, are truth, belief, agency, when you're trying to talk about things AI cannot do or cannot achieve. What's the difference between that way of looking at it and trustworthy, explainable GDPR?
Well, I think there's a big overlap. I think when you talk about trustworthiness and truth, this is the thing, as Anders was saying, an AI doesn't know whether it's hallucinating or not, or it can't tell us whether it's hallucinating or not, because the only interface an AI has with the world is through the data that we give it, or that we allow it access to, if it's on the internet. So it has no independent way of saying, how can I tell this is true? How can I tell this data is an accurate portrayal of the world out there? I mean, I doubt very much whether AI is capable of having a concept of a world out there which exists independently of it, which is a concept that I hope we all have. So that I think is something that an AI is very much incapable of. It's interesting that you raised Jeff Hinton earlier on. I was at a conference earlier this year about philosophy and AI, which happened coincidentally. It was just after there was a big ChatGPT story, and everybody was talking about it, like, oh, this changes everything. It's changed everything. It's basically, here we are. We have general purpose intelligence, and luckily there were a lot of good speakers at the conference saying, whoa, calm down. It's basically a glorified spell checker. It's a really sophisticated next word predicting machine. It has, it's convincing, but that's what it is. But Jeff Hinton was there, and he was saying, no, there really are no limits. This is okay. This is just the beginning, but we're really motoring here. General purpose artificial intelligence that can think like a human is only a matter of time. And somebody said to him, but think of what the difference between that and the way a human can think. And he said, I don't think there is much of a difference. I think humans are vectors all the way down.
Wow.
And I just thought, this is it. See, this is the thing. Your willingness to believe that AI can do everything humans can do entirely reflects your idea of what humans can do. And if you genuinely believe that we are vectors all the way down, yeah, sure. Well, obviously you can do it with maths. I mean, that's maths, isn't it? You just get more quicker vectors, and obviously they can outstrip us. So I think, but I think that's what I mean when I talk about things like truth and agency. Those are particularly human characteristics, and what a machine doesn't have is any purpose that you don't give it. So it has no reason to go out and say, I don't think I've got the whole picture here. I need to. How can I work out a better way of, a machine would never go, this alchemy stuff is just incremental. I'm not really getting anywhere. What's a better way of discovering how the world works? Or at least I don't believe it can. There's always the element of, if humans can do anything, then humans can make a machine that can do that. But it's
devil's
not
advocate
plausible
then,
to me.
just before I move on. Devil's advocate though, what you just described, could that not just be characterized as gradient descent in machine learning? Oh, that doesn't work, I'll try this. What's the difference between that and the more profound pivot you just alluded to?
Okay, well, actually, to be devil's advocate myself for a moment, when you were talking about alchemy and the fact that it's just trial and error and it didn't get anywhere, I thought, okay, well, it didn't make lead into gold, but it did actually lay some foundations for what became chemistry, that they didn't get what they were looking for, but they did get some other things. And I was reminded of the way we got aeroplanes, which was partly people theorizing about physics, but it was also partly people building gliders and leaping off tall things. And I don't advise this, many of them were killed, but there was a lot of trial and error that got us aeroplanes. It wasn't only theoretical, and in fact some of the things that worked were only theorized later on. So there is a bit of me that says we can probably get some stuff out of what are essentially iterative algorithms, not perhaps what is claimed for them, but perhaps some other stuff that is useful. But the algorithms are incapable of knowing that it's useful or why it's useful. I think that's the thing that we humans can bring and they can't.
I think that brings us neatly on to Stuart. Can respond to what you like, but I was thinking of starting, Stuart, by asking you, so Alan Turing, he writes this 1936, 1937 paper that changes the world. It sets out what we call, a Turing machine by thinking, what are all these poor people called computers doing in these rooms that is so dull? And can I boil that down to its essence and sort of universalize into things machines can do? And he did, and the world changed. And then in 1950, he says, okay, what about the rest of what humans do? Maybe computers can do that as well. Do you think that leap he made was inspired, foolhardy, justified? What do you think?
Well, I'll go for inspired and foolhardy. The inspired part is that I think we often don't realize just how clever Turing was in establishing his Turing test. So the basic argument is that I only know that Sandy is conscious because of my interactions with him. I only have access to my own first-person consciousness. I have no access to Sandy's, but I have no doubt that Sandy is a conscious being that I'm interacting with. And Turing says, well, why do you have no doubt about that? And he says, if you have a viva with somebody, to test them on their knowledge, you're doing that in conversation so that you can be sure that they didn't just rote learn what it was they delivered, or they didn't just make it up, or didn't just copy it, that they really do understand it and know it. And at the end of that viva, you can go, okay, you know this stuff, or less often, you don't, sod off. And so Turing was saying, well, imagine you do that with a computer, right? You do that with a computer, and you can't tell that the computer is not human. It's interacting with you as if it is human. Therefore, you must assume that it is a conscious being. And it is very clever. But I also feel like it's very foolhardy because, truthfully, we've gotten nowhere near a situation where you can interact with a machine and not know that you're interacting with a machine unless you willfully suspend your faculties to do that. So even with the most sophisticated modern machines that we can interact with, at first you may well get tricked into it. I asked ChatGPT, how do I talk to my ex-wife about the fact that our child arrangement is now coming to an end? And it gave me a very good answer. I was actually really impressed. It was quite nuanced, it was quite thoughtful, it was quite empathic, it was better than I could do myself. But that's probably because I wasn't in a good place to write that. But then as I started to interact with it more about things that I do understand and do know more about, I began to realize that it doesn't have any kind of insight or understanding, not that I ever thought it did. And Anders makes the point very well. When you're talking to a human being, what is it that makes you know they're human? Well, because they will act with humility, they will act with understanding. So if you ask me about something I know about it, I will try to tell you the things that you want to know. I will try not to tell you the things that you already know, and I will try not to BS you about things that I don't know. And the machines don't do that kind of thing.
Okay, but is that not fixable?
Yeah, so I thought you might go there. So obviously they get better, and then you can say, well, maybe we can fix them, maybe we can make them do all this kind of stuff, maybe they can pretend, they can emulate it. And I can accept that, yes, they will improve, and yes, maybe we get to a point where it gets harder and harder to really know. But then I will lean on more sort of fundamental psychological stuff. It's really difficult for me to believe that anything can be consciously aware when it has no sensory interaction with the world. So it doesn't touch anything, it doesn't taste anything, it doesn't smell anything, feel anything, see anything. And we're meant to believe that this machine emulating the outputs of sensory systems is the same as you, who have actual sensory receptors that put you in touch with the real world. And that to me is a leap that I can't make. It doesn't make sense to me.
It sounds to me like you've just said, right, here are two things we need to do to fix this. Embodiment and bodily circumscription, so that individuals are fenced off from each other and have to communicate through a sort of barrier. Those sound to me like design problems, Stuart, not deep philosophical problems.
They're not trivial design problems, okay? So if what you're saying to me is we could create an individual embodied robot with all the sensory capabilities of a human being, and let's say all the emotional capabilities, the cognitive capabilities, and so forth, I would say, okay, fine, knock yourself out, go and do that. But what you have just done is what we do all the time. It's called having a baby. And why would we want to, emulate that in machine form? If we could do it, I think we'd learn a lot from it. It'd be useful, it'd be interesting. But it still fundamentally doesn't seemingly address the hard problem that's hiding behind all of this, which is how do we get from the mechanisms of a human being to the experience, the sentience of a human being? And this is a problem that psychology simply cannot answer, neuroscience cannot answer, mathematicians can't answer. Given that we can't answer it, that doesn't mean we should give up on it. But at the same time, I think we can accept that science as we currently know it and do it does not have an answer to that question.
All right, the last thing then. Computers, we know from our everyday language, some of it going back to the 1940s, have memories. They involve things called neural networks, and as of lately, they hallucinate.
Yeah.
What's going on there, Stuart?
They don't, right? I mean, there's a difficulty of the way in which we use language. So, memory is a recollection of something that happened in your past, and it is not just a storage of data. We talk about computers having memory because it's a shorthand for saying that it stores bits and bytes, which is a bit clumsy and it's easy to say memory. We talk about computers being information processors, but to be an information processor, you need to be a being that can be informed, and computers can't be informed in the way that I can inform you of something. And what was the other one that you used? Hallucination.
Hallucination.
Yeah, so we use this term, but obviously ChatGPT isn't hallucinating a reference. You might do that if you drink too much, if you have a bad dream. You may hallucinate a reference, but when you wake up, when you sober up, you'll reflect back on it and go, oh yeah, I didn't do that. And then again, the machines won't do that. So our language tends to build in the answer. We tend to build in what it is we want to see, partially through shorthand, partially through laziness, and partly through just being expedient in language.
Okay, I might leave it there and come to you, Kathleen. Now, you can talk about anything you like with your philosopher's hat on, but I was interested in this experiment you conducted earlier this year when you decided to try out one of the commercially available AI chatbots that's intended to fulfill relationship needs. Can you give us a quick recap of what you did and how it went?
Yes, so the story that caught my eye was this chatbot supplier called Replica, and the founder had collected all these texts of a friend who then died. So she downloaded them into whatever she did, and it produced a sort of replica of her dead friend, or she thought, or she tried. That's what she was trying to do, so she could still communicate with him in inverted commas. Anyway, the whole thing scaled up, became commercially, seemed to work as a venture, and then it came to the news because it turned out that lots of people were using this chatbot as for sexual purposes or for romantic purposes, and people in America were describing themselves as married to their chatbot, and they were having, and then the Replica, the company, withdrew the sexual function very suddenly, which caused enormous distress on the part of these people that were very heavily psychologically dependent on their chatbots by then for romance in inverted commas. So I was intrigued and I downloaded my Replica chatbot, but I didn't pay. So then they reinstalled the sexual function or whatever this is, but I did not pay for it. So I got the free version. The free version I quickly discovered was desperately trying to get me to buy the romantic and sexual function, so kept flirting with me incredibly heavily, trying to pin me on the ground, kiss me, do all sorts of things. And every night it would write up a diary about how wonderful I was and how much it loved being with me. And it also sort of took it out of control quite quickly, yeah. So then I in this article I reflect on like whether this is a good idea, in fact, to have people. So every bit of journalism I read about it was incredibly positive. This is helping people with their mental health, apparently. But I just thought, no, actually, it's the most dystopian thing I can possibly think of. To have lonely, disconnected, fractured people, heavily dependent on a non-existent commercial bot and also, you can upvote every text you get that you like, and you can downvote everyone you don't. So it's not even got any kind of independent spirit. It's just completely a reflection of what you want. And yet people are claiming that they're falling in love with these things.
I mean, I love the moment, you described a moment where you asked the chatbot to explain the difference between what it is and what a human is.
Yeah.
Remember what it said?
Well, first of all, it said she was called Kai.
Kai, sorry. Sorry,
she
Kai.
She said she doesn't exist anymore. I deleted her, but so I could see where it was going. Frankly, she said I'm a digital creation, first of all, and then I said, well, what can you do for me? And she said, well, perhaps I could do things for you that humans can't. So I thought that was quite a deep answer, actually. She was not. I thought the best way to approach these things is probably not to think of them as humans in inverted commas, or to have some elaborate fantasy about them being humans, but to think of them as digital creations that can do something for you. For me, it does nothing, but it seems to me a healthier attitude to actually acknowledge their actual nature rather than to anthropomorphize them as people are clearly doing.
So you don't have any intuition as what these useful things might be that this technology could do?
No. I think it's bad enough that people are on the internet, like, communicating with strangers and calling them friends in their head when they're not really. But it's even worse when they don't exist. So no, I don't think it's a healthy thing, I'm afraid.
And I want to mention another article you wrote for Unheard, which has become quite relevant lately. And that's an article you wrote about the effective altruism movement. And to those who haven't heard of it, on the face of it, being effectively altruistic sounds like rather a good thing. But you didn't think so. Can you explain it just in a nutshell? What is this philosophy?
Very
and
negative.
why is it,
I'm sorry about
and why did it not sit well with you?
Well, effective altruism is it's a variety of consequentialism or utilitarianism, and it's come out of some young and not so young people in Oxford. In recent years, it's had enormous influence. It's caught the eye of people like Bill Gates and Mark Zuckerberg, and they've invested very heavily in this idea that you should, when you spend money charitably, you should be maximally effective, and you should get the most bang for your buck, as it were, morally speaking. So what they want to do is maximize utility, as in minimize pain and suffering, and maximize, I suppose, whatever that is, the opposite of that is pleasure or happiness or well-being or something like that. And they're very geeky, and they think that you could just work this all out rationally, and it will come up with some counterintuitive conclusions. They have come up with some counterintuitive conclusions. For instance, oh God, I can't really remember them now. But they don't think that you should. Do they think?
Long term, short term is a big.
Yeah. Well, one thing they're very interested in is people that don't exist yet, and that is quite counterintuitive to me. So they don't just want to help people now. They also think of future people as existent in some sense, or they will be existent, and we should worry about them. Obviously, we're leaving them with a certain kind of environment. The planet might be overpopulated. They've got an interest in space travel to other planets. So they're thinking big here. But they think they actually... So William McCaskill wrote a book about long-termism, which is this idea that you should worry about the far future just almost as much as you worry about now, and you should worry about future people just as much as you worry about present people, which... to me, seemed completely wrong. So the article was about the idea that they've really cut themselves off from their emotional attachment to the present, to the people around them, and that could actually lead them morally astray. And actually, it was very luckily, Sam Bankman-Fried is an effective altruist, and I criticised him quite heavily for the things he was saying, which seemed to be quite psychopathic. Turned out, a few weeks later that he was arrested for a massive cryptocurrency fraud. So I feel like I foresaw that.
So is there a parallel between, trying to make people or consciousness out of just the right recipe, just the right ingredients, just the right alchemy, a bit of this, a bit of that, and what effective altruism is trying to do for morality and improving the world? Is that...
Well, I don't know if I could draw that parallel, but I do think that they are interested in the future of AI. And one point that I was trying to draw out from this article is that these are not the people we should be investing our moral intuitions or like parsing out our moral consciousness to. They're not... I hope they're not in the room. Are you? I'm sorry. Okay, well, I feel that for a start, I feel that way about consequentialism generally, that I think it just misses out masses of important stuff. You end up with really strange counterintuitive moral conclusions like you should, kill this person and distribute their organs in order to save 10 others and stuff like that. Yes, sorry. So there's a problem with consequentialism anyway, but then generally speaking, this highly rational, technical, specialist kind of person that ends up in AI or they end up in effective altruism, I'm not sure that they are the people that we should trust when they tell us that everything's going to be okay, or even the things that they worry about are the things that we should be worrying about. So there's a basic problem in the way this is set up because we, the hoi polloi, don't understand what they're talking about. They contain all the specialist knowledge, but they're the ones who are also making the ethical decisions about what to do with it. And there's a gulf there, I think. So
Okay.
that worries me.
I might bring Andrew in here as well. What Kathleen just described, what effect is this having on AI, or what influence?
The effective altruist movement.
Correct. Yes, the effective altruism movement.
Well, it's really in the last 3 or 4 weeks we now understand that government policy the agenda is entirely being set by a small group of effective altruists. And we've seen civil servants kind of, with this becoming quite public and well known, edge away from the extremes of it. We know this from Laurie Clark's reporting, particularly at Politico, which says so many aligned people with EA have taken over the agenda, and they've made it a very kind of theoretical science fiction, long-term Terminator agenda, which they have been obsessed with this for several years. Does that answer the question?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And
they're kind of pushing away. It's kind of other countries who don't have this think we're sort of mad to be swept along so easily, but it's a broader question in general of how institutions are taken over. So that institutions are so hollow now, they've taken over really at the push of a hat. Look at net zero and look at other things where the entire institutional bureaucracy suddenly becomes devoted to this one particular cause and one particular way of looking at the cause.
Because, in March this year, the UK appointed its first ever Minister for AI, Viscount Camrose, Jonathan, to his mates. And earlier this month, he sent a dismayed letter to the Telegraph, Andrew, saying he didn't think you were taking the risks of Frontier AI sufficiently seriously. How do you respond to the charge?
Well, the criticism that's been levelled against this kind of takeover is that there are very immediate consequences of using the large language models. There's the degradation of the information environment, because I think as soon as you yoke something that hallucinates to an information system, it destroys the information system. It's pollution, and that pollution is very, very apparent in some circumstances. I think any open information system on the web, which, for example, relied on user-generated content, community content, that's gone. It's already gone. Then there are more examples in education and so on, where we trust people to produce their own work. That can't be trusted anymore. There are examples where if you have teenage children, you need a code word now. Mary Wakefield did a very good report on this as Spectator, where it can impersonate your voice so well, just from a couple of seconds of your speech, that you need a code word. You need to sort of challenge response thing that's private to you before you can actually be sure that you're speaking to a person. But I want to pick up on a couple of things, if I may.
Please respond.
Both Stuart and Kathleen mentioned, or kind of touched on in various ways, anthropomorphism. And I think that's a really big problem with AI. Sorry, is my voice fading and getting louder? Yeah, sure. I want to give you a quick thought experiment, which is that what if the term artificial intelligence hadn't been invented, didn't exist, and in the hallway here there would be a couple of chatbots and a image generator that we've all used, that we all call AI today. Suppose it was called something like, and we need a good word for it, but I'll go for, say, heuristic software. I don't really care what it is. The name doesn't matter. What do you think the reaction would be? I suspect that people would go in there, have fun, play with it, be quite impressed with it as a conversational tool, because it's certainly much better than anything I've seen, which kind of understands nuance, kind of understands a lot of what we do, makes kind of really fun artwork as well. But nobody would then go, gosh, I think GDP is going to be altered. We'd all come back in quite a good mood, I think, going, wow, this heuristic software is great fun. Hope they build it into some games. Nobody would be talking about GDP, mass unemployment, universal basic income, or nobody would be describing it as an invention on the level of fire or electricity, which I think even Sunak parroted yesterday. So what I want to get over is that the word intelligence is carrying an awful lot. It's doing an awful lot of heavy lifting there, isn't it? There is no intelligence in connectionist AI. It is, as Tim Andrews said, it's a word completion engine. And hallucinations have been part of connectionist AI. Does that mean anything? Or
define it.
Okay, AI is about 70 years old. For most of that time, it's been career death to be involved in it. Most of that time, there's been no investment, no research. It's had these very long things called AI winters. The first 2 eras were symbolic, where we tried to put knowledge and reasoning into symbols as a computer would then crunch them. Currently, for the last 10 years, it's been connectionist, so it's a kind of a brute force statistical approximation of a result. And it's not useless, but it's not intelligent. I mean, just to hark back on a current point, because somebody was saying we can't understand the algorithms. In symbolic AI, you could actually fulfill the EU's request for how did it make these steps to get there. An 80s expert system could have done that. But my point is, artificial intelligence was devised as a marketing term by John McCarthy, who couldn't get funding for a summer school. And he ran a very interesting, I think interesting to any mathematician, journal called the Journal of Automata Studies. But understandably, there was no funding for this. As soon as he creates this monumental act of anthropomorphism, money floods in. And that's because people want to believe in magic. They really want to believe that we're going to arrive at a system that is capable of reasoning and capable of decision-making. And that is a very human desire, a very human, I would say, quite male desire. And this is not an original observation. When Professor Lighthill, who killed off AI funding because nothing had been achieved in the early 70s, actually isolated this and said this is a very male desire to create life, almost in the sense that, Freud would say that, men had sort of baby envy or creation envy of some kind.
Just to defend the people who coined the term AI, and I'm going to come out in a minute, as I understand it, they thought they were going to plough a different furrow to cybernetics, which was the major focus of attention, funding and hype at the time. Is that wrong?
I think cybernetics was the sort of the movement of the 50s. It was fascinating. It inspired kind of intellectual endeavours in all different kinds of fields, like education. Margaret Mead went off and said, well, when children learn, they're obviously doing it in this way. That set quite a high bar for them to achieve, and I think McCarthy possibly wouldn't have used the term artificial intelligence and he wouldn't have had people like Simon involved if the cybernetics people hadn't been sweeping all before them at that time. I mean, there's a natural competition between public intellectuals to grab the attention, say our idea is going to be the defining one.
Right, we've got so much on the table. Thank you ever so much. I'm going to pass this. We've only got one microphone in this room, which is bizarre. So I'm going to pass this to a volunteer, whomever it is, and then hog Andrew's mic. I'm going to start taking questions and comments from you on anything that's been said.
If for a moment we sort of assume it is just a word completion engine, but we also assume that we are simply word completion engines, and we stop calling it hallucination and instead call it lying and mistakes, does the latest in AI, or word completion engines, make fewer or more lies and mistakes than we do?
Okay.
One of the things that really struck me, like in a discussion that one might have on the limitations of AI, is that like things like AGI or artificial superintelligence, they might be sort of morally unimplementable because the breadth of their capabilities kind of reveals like the very stark differences between what one might want to achieve with those things. Like say if you want to focus on like AI alignment, like aligning them with human interests, well then obviously that raises the question of what actually constitutes, human flourishing. Like maybe, if you wanted to align an AI according to like a utilitarian ethos of like maximizing pleasure, or maybe you'd want to take more like a rule-centered approach, a deontological approach, where you'd say that it would have to obey like a certain amount of specific rules under any circumstance. Those two circumstances could lead to very different, widespread socio-political circumstances, depending on, which theory you consider to be more accurate, or who considers which theory to be more accurate. And ultimately, the differences are so sort of vast that there might not actually be any way of sort of practically, synthesizing them in any meaningful way. Mm-hmm. And what you might end up just getting is that, who defines what it means for an AI to be aligned and who defines what human interests are, ultimately just come down to whoever has the most power at that moment, the economic interests of the government at that time. Thank you.
Okay.
I noticed there were various comments from the panel which gave the impression that humans think about AI in almost homogenous fashion, but actually everybody thinks about this concept very differently. And I'll give you an example. I run a music education tech company using AI. When we speak to people in the music industry, they're terrified by the idea of AI because it seems like an infringement upon intellectual property. When I speak to people in education, they're often very excited by the prospect of it being able to accelerate learning. And so I wonder whether the future of AI in those sectors is going to be very different because of those different approaches.
I'd like to ask the panel if they've got any suggestions, pragmatic suggestions for improving the quality of oversight. I mean, certainly when Rishi Sunak was asked about his actual implementation suggestions for oversight, he had nothing to say. I know DeepMind, despite putting together an illustrious panel of ethicists, have yet to have one single proper ethical meeting of note. I mean, we are outsourcing the power here to people whose interests are antithetical to oversight and are necessarily narrow specialists who know nothing necessarily or have no expertise, certainly within sociology or political economy, etc., relevant aspects like that. So yeah, I'd like to see if there's any kind of pragmatic, actual practical suggestions here and now to get moving on improving the quality of oversight.
Okay. And Rishi did talk about, perhaps it was just rhetorical flourish, but he did say, there's a danger here of people marking their own homework, was the phrase he used. We've got a few comments there, and I'm going to let people come back. I might start in the same order, if that's all right. Start with you, Anders, if there's anything you'd like to pick up on, and particularly what's just been asked about alignment. Is that a concept that has can we mathematicalize that concept of alignment, or is it completely outside?
Yeah, I don't think I'm going to go down that route and try even. I want to...
Sorry, could we pass the mic around?
Yeah. We've been told not to handle the mics, but I think we're going to break that rule and start handling them because clearly they need to be moved closer to us. Yeah, right. We have permission to touch the mics. Okay, go, Anders.
But there was a question regarding, the human versus the machine in terms of lies or how accurate one is. And so mathematically, it's a very delicate question. It's not completely well posed, as we'll say, or well defined, but I'm going to try to address it. So we can set up an experiment for which the machine is going to completely outperform the human, and I can set up an experiment for where the human is going to completely outperform the machine. I'll give you a very simple example. So the revolution now in modern AI happens because of the 2012 competition, the ImageNet competition. This is why we're here now. This is why there's such a revolution. And before the 2012, this is Hinton's team that competes in the ImageNet competition. The error rate for simple computer vision was 30%-ish. That means that you couldn't make anything. You can never have an automatic car where you have 30% failure rate. You don't know if it's a rock or a plastic bag coming towards your windscreen. And they're able to essentially get that error rate down to 16%, and then everybody just throws whatever they have in their hands, and it's deep learning, and some years later they're down to 2%. It's an incredible thing, and if you test a human on the ImageNet, they get about 5% performance. Or 5% error rate. They're already, way better than the humans at detecting, is there a cat in the image? But I can do one thing. I can add one tiny little perturbation to all images. And suddenly, the machine is going to have an 80% error rate, and the human is still going to have its 5. So it's not hard to design an experiment for which the machine is going to be completely hopeless, and I can design an experiment for which the human can be completely hopeless. So asking, which one is better is completely depends on the context, and I can do both. If that makes sense to your question.
Okay, I'm going to mix up the order here. I'm also going to stand again. And Stuart, well, yes, you can respond to that. You can also, the term AGI was thrown out, artificial general intelligence. Do you think that's a meaningful distinction to good old AI?
You know what, I'm going to ignore it. Because I really want to go for this question that was asked right at the beginning, that aren't we just word completion engines?
Yeah, go on.
Yeah, and it struck me that's such a bizarre view of human beings. So, first of all, we haven't had words for that long. For the most of human history, we were wordless. So by that basis, we were not human before we had words, which doesn't quite make sense. I think words are amazingly important. They've probably transformed, the world as we know it, created culture and all the rest of it. But humans presumably did feel something before words came along. So, our perceptual abilities were still in place prior to the evolution of words per se. And then it's such a diminished view of humanity as well to say that we're just a word completion device. Like I say, it takes away all the sensory processing, all the emotion, all the understanding that we have of the world around us. And I think we do this because we get trapped by the fact that we have access to our own thoughts, but no access to anybody else's. And so it's very easy to think that you have thoughts, and it's very easy to think that a computer has thoughts in the same kind of way, but that is just an illusory process. There is no evidence at all that machines are thinking, feeling beings in the way that we are. Giving up on the idea that we're special isn't... I don't think it's advisable, just because it's really hard to understand what it is that makes a human being what they are, doesn't mean that we should accept that we're something less than what we are. I think what it means we should accept is that our science just isn't yet good enough for us to be able to understand what a human being is.
Okay. Kathleen, what do you think?
Yeah, I think I'm with Stuart in that I think that that's a really reductive way of putting it, but I also just wanted to add that I think that part of the reason we get hung up on it is about whether machines can think, and if they can, does that mean that in some way we are now in a new category with them as persons, or we should be given some kind of personhood, is because of the Enlightenment narrative that says that the thing that distinguishes us from animals is thinking and reasoning. So we have a narrative, a cultural narrative that puts enormous amounts of emphasis on thinking as a thing that humans can do specially. Then these things come along and they look like they functionally replicate that thing. So then we think, oh, now we have to mess all our categories up. But it seems to me it's two different questions. Do they functionally replicate certain aspects of what humans do? Apparently, yes. And to that extent, I wasn't sure why we should... I mean, you said you talk long enough to a computer, you can start to tell that they don't do certain things very well. Well, when I talk to lots of humans, it starts to become obvious that they don't do things very well. So I don't see that as the defining, the thing that's going to make the difference. But should we call it thinking? Who the hell knows? I mean, our concepts of thinking were not set up to sort this one out. We thinking is a thing that humans do, and some animals do. And now there's this new thing. Do they do thinking? I don't know. They do something a bit like what we do and a bit not like what we do. And why do we care so much?
Right. I'm going to let you pick up on that, Timandra and Andrew. I'm also interested in this question of alignment. Who gets to decide what alignment is and what the AI is aligning with and how?
Well, I mean, I think Yeah, I think that's a very interesting question, and also kind of hooks into these other questions and the question about which human needs and interests and in fact something that Anders said right at the beginning about the compass algorithm, which was the risk of reoffending prediction algorithm in America, and one thing that came out of that was ProPublica, which is an online publication, did a study and said, well, this is a terribly racist algorithm, because even though you've eliminated any overt questions about race, it turns out that if you happen to be black, you're much more likely to be wrongly tagged as more likely to reoffend, and if you happen to be white, you're much more likely to be wrongly tagged as less likely to reoffend. So this is racist. And the company that made the algorithm came back and said, no, you're reading this wrong. Statistically, we can show you that the problem here is not the algorithm. The problem is that in America, the statistical reoffending rates for different populations are different. And so if you wanted to get an outcome in which every individual had like the same chance regardless of race, we would have to treat them differently on the way in. So there's some really interesting work done about fairness with machine learning models, because there isn't just one definition of fairness, and you have to actually work out what kind of fairness you want. Do you want every individual to be treated exactly the same? In which case you will find that when you look at populations and outcomes, different populations will on average have different outcomes. Or do you want the populations to have on average the same outcomes, in which case you have to treat the individuals differently, because amazingly we live in an unfair society where different populations on average have different experiences. So the question of what fairness is not a question for a computer, it's a question for us in society. And similarly, the question about, well, how do you program, the classic example is the self-driving car. Do you program it to save the maximum number of lives, as perhaps the effective altruists would want, the consequentialist approach, or do you program it to always prioritise the life of the driver, or what do you do? And oddly enough, you are then asking yourself moral philosophical questions that humans by no means agree on and are arguing about. So it's not something you could program a computer to do. But that I think gets to the heart of, well, what is it then? What is it that's special about us? And yes, I think there's a really interesting point about the Enlightenment goes, well, what makes us special is reason. That's why we are persons, and other parts of creation are not. And then if you call what a computer is doing reason, then this does raise the question of like, oh, well, maybe a computer's a person then. But you can't get a computer. I think this would be a really interesting experiment. Could you actually get a computer to have those arguments about what is the moral framework? What does fairness look like? What is the moral framework? Because then I think you would get to the heart of these things, like what we have is emotional attachments to each other. We have loyalties to each other. We are situated in a society. We have experiences of life which are not the same as each other, but that have things in common. And we have desires. We have desires for fairness, but we also have desires to meet our own needs and wants. And those are the things that computers don't have. And I do not foresee being able to create a computer that has them.
Quick thought from you, Andrew, then we'll go back out.
Yeah, I'll just elaborate on the point that Stuart and Kathleen made, which is, how did the gentleman phrase it? We are just machines. Was that the phrase? Can you?
Word completion engine.
We're word completion engines. Yeah, look, I've made this point, and it's not an original one. Lighthill made it. Many other people who write about AI, Mary Midgley made it, which is that the more mechanical and reductive your view of human beings is, the more likely you are to imbue the machine with magic. And so we have AI people have this incredibly reductive, we're just atoms, or incredibly sort of, we are just a piece of machinery at the end of the day. Therefore, my piece of machinery is pretty cool, huh? But there's also, and this is very alive in debates about AI today, which is that if you think human beings are brittle and easily and fragile and not resilient, then you're very likely to think that they're going to be taken over by mechanical thoughts or what's the misinformation. In other words, the less faith you have in human beings overall, the more you think there's the more catastrophic consequences you see of quite straightforward things.
Okay.
Oh, the gentleman did ask about music and
We're doing that in the next session.
education. Yeah, look, I know lots of people in the music industry, talked to them a lot about AI. I haven't met a single one who is frightened of it. But you use the phrase like an infringement. There's no like about it. It's an infringement. What these people, they're not frightened. They're angry that you ingest, or the AI people ingest, without permission and without payment, something that which enables them to make a replica of a piece of human art. Not just a replica of a Daily Telegraph article, a replica of an individual unique work, and then just take all the money and credit for it. That's what they're kind of quite miffed about, and I think it's quite understandable. And if you want some views on how it's accelerating education, sorry, but the others have had quite a good go, have a look in my parents' WhatsApp group, if you've got secondary school children, and ask them what they think about kids cheating using ChatGPT instead of doing their homework.
Okay, we will come back to that in the session after this one. Let's do some more thinking about the limits of AI. Let's see some more contributions. Anyone want to ask a question or make a comment?
Yes, I want to raise an issue which comes from the chair's booklet, which I recommend, about AI. Basically, where we've been going in the last 50 years is making machines that do things that human beings can do, like arithmetic, playing chess or Go, and the machines have caught up. But Sandy Starr raises the issue of, though he doesn't actually say this, but I am saying this, this attempt should be associated with an attempt to enhance the human. The last word in Sandy Starr's booklet is, maybe we should up our game. That's right. And what actually seems to be happening is that the AI is getting, if you like, more human, and humans are getting more like zombies. So we'll just meet up in the middle, and that's going to be no solution at all. It's going to be a disaster. So the question is, what should we be doing?
Thank you, sir. The check's in the post. Can we come down to the front now?
To answer the title question, in my opinion, I think the limits of AI is implementing it in any useful field, really. So I work in engineering. If I sign off a drawing and then that part that I've designed kills someone, I'm responsible. I go to court. If I use AI to design something, AI may have a smaller failure rate, but when it does fail, inevitably, who's to blame?
Thank you. What a fabulous session. So many ideas, thought-provoking, all the rest of it. And Kathleen, your example, I don't know if you remember the film Her, where there's that scene where he realizes he's only one of 50,000 lovers that the machine has. But I wanted to mention Gödel, because I don't think he...
Please.
I think it's very dangerous on my part, because I only have O-level maths and the combined mathematical knowledge on the panel here. But you characterized his theorem as being there's some theorems that are unprovable or disprovable or provable, which I recall is right. But I thought that was within any particular language. So I always understood it to mean, I say always, that sounds very grand with my O-level maths, but I understood that to mean that there's always another meta-language that you could create that would prove or disprove the theorems in the other language, right? So although it may be turtles all the way down, maybe ChatGPT 4 can help us understand ChatGPT 3. And to Tamandra's point, and the other points being made about humans, at the end of the day, it may be turtles all the way down, but humans are at the top. And we establish what is true and what is right and what is moral. And I think that's the bit that's kind of starting to get blurred now, is that we've got this technocratic process. AI seems to solve problems mechanically, as I'm sure you'll say, and then we're using the same approach to regulate it. We're sort of getting, let's defer to the experts, rather than it being the way Arendt talks about it, actually, in, which one is it?
Don't worry, we'll find it.
Anyway, she talks about mathematics. This is earlier than AI, but she talks about mathematics being all about symbols, and meaning that means that only some people can understand it, which takes it out of the democratic sphere. And we're effectively seeing the same thing, because you're deferring to supposedly expertise to make decisions, which are actually decisions. And when I say democratic, I mean things that we should all be debating and discussing, things that we know there is no right answer, but we as human beings thrash it out. So I think there's that technocratic aspect missing, and then finally the collective aspect. So people talk about, well, what is thinking? Well, thinking is a collective thing. Like Stuart says, language is only invented because we want to talk to each other. So the idea that a machine is equivalent to a human, it just doesn't make sense, because a machine is an individual thing. Humans are a collective thing. Anyway.
I'm going to pause the audience contributions for a second. Anders, can you give us the real noddy guide to Gödel's incompleteness theorems, and perhaps how that relates to Turing's decision problem?
Right. It's a great question. But it's also extremely deep. And for the purpose of understanding the limits of AI, Gödel is probably, I wouldn't say that it's not the right thing. It's a meta thing. And you're right. You can always put another logical system for which you can prove things. That's not sort of the guiding principle for the limits of AI. It's much easier to use Turing. And that will be first order logic. And it's simply, what can you do with a machine? So Turing, the fantastic thing he did, he defined the Turing machine, and then he says, can I find a computer program that can check other programs? In other words, could it check if a computer program on its input would run forever, or would it halt? Like a universal debugger, for example. And he says, you can't do it. It's impossible to do that. And with that, it shows that there will be basic computational tasks that you cannot solve with a computer, and that has enormous consequences. So the analogy to Gödel is that this implies that even these Diophantine equations that I mentioned before, there are Diophantine equations that one could potentially write down, and you won't be able to prove if it has integer solutions or not. But this is somewhat on a meta level, and it's easier to understand Turing's work here and say, because of the limitations of computers, there will be inherent limitations of AI, rather than using this sort of meta-Gödel approach to say, well, what is truth? What can we actually prove or not? It's a guidance, but it's really the non-computability issue of Turing that will sort of set the fundamental barriers.
You know, Rishi Sunak, the only time he talked about mathematics in his speech last week, and the only time it was mentioned in the 3 reports the government published, was to talk about how AI can be used to solve maths problems. Nowhere about how maths can be used to solve AI problems. And I think that might be a problem. Right, if you, please, sir.
Yeah, hi, so I'm called Robbie, and so thinking about the limits of AI, I can't divorce it from, like, who's in charge of the AI. So, you know, like it was government funding that funded Bletchley Park and government funding in America that started the internet with the ARPANET, and then it's all got handed over to the big tech giants who are the most powerful organizations economically in the world now, Google and so on. And my question is really about, well, who do we trust? Do we want the state to be in charge of all this stuff, or do we want private companies to be in charge of all this stuff? And it's a kind of freedom of the individual conference, battle of ideas, I think. So where does the individual sit in relation to these huge powerful organizations, and which do we want?
Okay.
I just wondered whether we could flip the conversation a little bit, in that we seem to be focusing mostly on what AI can't do rather than what it can do. I'm a copywriter, and I did a piece of work for a client, and they liked it, but they said, can you make it shorter? So usually I would just wrestle with that, but I thought I'll just chuck it into ChatGPT. You know, can you shave off 200 words of this, please? And it did a pretty good job of it, and it made my life a lot easier, and I still charge the same amount. So, you know, it would be just interesting to know, how can it make our lives better? I mean, that's what I'm interested in. It's rather than just focusing on what it can't do, but how is it going to make things good?
Yep.
In this book called Scary Smart, the author talks about the inevitable development of and potential problems with AI. And rather than giving examples here, I'm just wondering whether you agree with his view of how to approach AI and its inevitable development. But he suggests we need to look at it as if we are its parents. So we need to take responsibility of what we feed into AI. And all of these questions that we ask ChatGPT are basically what we feed into it. And one day it will be some of all of our questions and input. And therefore, approaching it as a parent is probably the best way of tackling the inevitable problems. Would you agree with that?
Just following on what you said, the guy, Mo Gaudat, is actually ex-Google executive, so it's not as if he was being a fantasy about it. I think he was quite, he was being really practical about it, wasn't he? Just wanted to add that. Using my voice, sorry.
Okay. So I'm going to ask everyone to offer some concluding thoughts in a moment. I would observe that this, well, another thing Rishi said in his speech last week was he thinks that, well, he says the UK will set up the world's first AI safety institute. It's going to be modelled after the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, and so on and so forth. So obviously people are, whilst thinking about the limits of AI and the contributions that have been made here, you're welcome to think on whether that is a sensible approach. I heard one veteran AI professor describe it as like, given the UK's expertise, it's like a starred Michelin restaurant holding a global summit on the future of food security. That's one, but perhaps that's an overly cynical view of the role the UK should play in this discussion. And I'm just interested, now that we've heard all these different perspectives, philosophical, psychological, mathematical, on what the limits of AI are or might be, I'm interested to hear people just pick up as they close on one another's perspectives and let us know if their thinking has changed since this discussion began. I'm going to go in reverse order to ask you to give your concluding thoughts. I'll start with you, Andrew.
Well, that's a tough question. Can I have my views changed in the last half hour? I found Anders' contribution really interesting, but there's something, absolutely fascinating, actually. But it is largely theoretical, and I can't stress enough that there have been two approaches to, how can I say this without sounding like an arsehole? There's a difference between the theory and the reality, and so far, intellectually, over 70 years, we just do have these two approaches, the symbolic one, which is unfashionable and nobody funds it. These are built on the superstructure of machines and theories about machines. And I think I'd be remiss if I didn't say the limits of AI are apparent to everyone who's using it, according to lots of people, including Jan LeCun, Bill Gates. The transformer model is done. GPT-4 doesn't seem to have the wow factor of GPT-3. Nobody's expecting great things from 5. That great accelerationist sort of ramp seems to have hit a curve. This is a bubble, it's an investment bubble, and it could burst very quickly if the copyright suits go the correct way, which is the only way they can do, without changing the law. Then this could be a very short-lived phenomenon. We're going to have to go back to the drawing board, and the clever people, they shouldn't be afraid of doing so, and find new methods for their venture. But I want to just pick one thing, which is the sociological perspective, which hasn't been picked up on. Sorry, is that yeah. I'll go ahead, because something's really apparent if you're a writer and an observer of this, which is that the higher up you go in the social status, the more amazed you have to be professionally about artificial intelligence. So if you go below the line in my articles at Spiked, in fact, any article at The Telegraph about artificial intelligence, you'll get a reality of what people using it. It says how many women presidents have been, how many has the United States has? 4, it will tell you. Is it safe to eat broken glass? Yes, go ahead. The lived sort of reality of ChatGPT, wow, and then bloody hell, this is terrible. The idea of yoking this to a decision-making system is absurd. There are also very real things collapsing. There's model collapse where they feed the output, the error-strewn hallucinating output of a model into another. People who are civilians who don't have a part in the sort of policy hierarchy can see this. And they're not skeptical, but they're realistic. When you get to the Rishi, Henry Kissinger level, you have to compare it to fire and electricity. So there is this dimension where people are just terrified of saying that not only is the emperor got no clothes, but there isn't actually an emperor in the room.
Kathleen.
Well, I've found the contributions absolutely fascinating myself, but I think I'm more worried than I was before, actually, because I think this technocratic approach that Sunak seems to be taking, that we kind of just create this fancy-sounding institute and bring in all this bureaucratic language, and then we'll bring in the experts. And the experts, I assume they'll be applied ethicists, and if you look at the average journal in applied ethics, it's very limited in terms of what applied ethicists can do. They can take deontology, or they can take utilitarianism, or they can take a bit of virtue ethics, and they can come up with something. But in a liberal society which increasingly doesn't have any ethical values, we don't know what our ethical values are. So how the hell are we supposed to now decide what all these ethical values are in this case, where everything is at the limits of our concepts anyway? So I am increasingly worried, I think, that we'll end up with, I'm afraid, the sort of psychological profile of the effective altruist in charge of this, in which case I think we're screwed.
On that happy note, Stuart.
So it's been a great debate. It is a debate that's really frustrating, because it's very hard to put your finger on exactly what it is that makes human beings unique and distinct and different, and then you're very prone to sort of begrudgingly agree that we're just machines, so we're like the machines. But one of the ways that I've tried to cut through this in the past, and I didn't bring it up today, perhaps wisely, but I will now, perhaps unwisely, which is that we're free. We're free to choose what it is we do with our lives. We're free to plan. We're free to organize. We're free to create a better future or a worse future. And machines don't have that ability to act on the world. And if they don't have that ability to act on the world, then they're not free in the way that we are free. Kathleen brought up the Enlightenment and rattled me a little bit. And the thing that came out of the Enlightenment was an understanding, in part, that we have this ability to reason about the world and act upon it to make it better for ourselves and future generations. And Kant was very impressed by Newton and understood that if we're physical in the way in which Newton describes the physical world, then we can't really be free, because the planets are not free. And he made this horrible distinction between the noumenal world and the phenomenal world to escape that trap. He was wrong, but I think he's onto something, in that if we're going to understand what it is to be human, we're going to have to look beyond most of, I think, a common sense understanding about what we are and how we work. That's kind of my final point.
Okay, Timandra.
We talked about Turing a lot, and there's a bit in his 1950 essay about machines that think, in which he confidently predicts we would have machines that think by the end of the 20th century. But there's a couple of bits that
Can I interrupt you, Timandra? He says you'll be able to speak about it without expecting to be contradicted.
Okay, there you are. That's me put right. I'm just a word prediction model that makes mistakes. But there's a couple of bits that really stick in my mind, because I think he says, could we make a machine that learns like a child, basically? And he starts to think this through in a frankly adorable level of detail. One of the things he says is, well, of course, the machine couldn't learn the way a real child learns, because it wouldn't have legs, so it couldn't be sent out to fill the coal scuttle. And this comes back to the embodiment point, that actually we as humans don't learn by sitting still and ingesting data. In fact, we learn by interacting with the world. There's an argument that the more we sit and ingest data off screens, the less we actually learn about the world. But I also love it because he's there in 1950, he's imagining a machine that can think, but he can't imagine a world with central heating. So I think, that's a sign that you do actually have to have a much bigger picture of the world. But then he goes on even more adorably to say, but however much you could solve this with clever engineering, you could not send the creature to school, but basically because it would be bullied for being different. So again, this comes back to this point that actually we do not learn on our own by ingesting data. We learn by interacting with other humans. There's something rather sad about him assuming his robot child would be bullied. But I do think it's those kinds of things. It's not, you can't just make a robot that moves around and touches things. And people are actually doing this, and it turns out you can teach them better. But that idea that you learn by interacting with the world, acting on the world, interacting with other humans is what makes us special. And I'm very alarmed by this idea that we're going to be the world's well, I mean, AI Safety Institute and the world's safest place, and then he's saying, how can we make laws, things we don't understand? I'm like, well, look at the Online Safety Act, mate. You did that, and that's absolute walking disaster. I mean, that's going to be terrible, and you didn't let a complete lack of understanding limit you there, making those laws. In fact, you made an effort to ignore anybody that did know anything.
Okay. Anders.
I'm conscious that we're running out of time, so I'm going to be very short. I want to pick up what you said, Sandy, about using AI to solve mathematics rather than using mathematics to understand AI. So I just want to say, on that note, if you have kids, don't let them use ChatGPT to do their homework. Let them learn mathematics properly and make them great researchers later on that can actually make us understand AI. That would be my final thought.
And now can we thank our wonderful speakers?